Good afternoon and welcome to the second episode of the Political Tipster. Now, on Thursday, we just had a lot of elections. So we had the local council elections in the majority of England, but we also had national elections in Scotland and Wales. So last week, we discussed in great detail the Welsh elections and also the sort of collapse of the Labour Red Wall on a more local level. So this week, I want to go into greater detail on the result of the Scottish election, because now we have Nicola Sturgeon pushing for a second referendum, so things are getting very interesting. But before we start that discussion, I would just like to look at last week's results on our predictions and tips. And I must say, it's been a very successful week. So we got 15 out of 18 correct. And if you had put £20 on each bet, which I would never recommend, but if you did, you would have come out with a total profit of about £185. So a good start from all accounts. So we'll just quickly look at what we predicted correctly and incorrectly, and then we'll move on to the discussion. So in Scotland, we said no SNP majority, which was at 2.18. That was correct. Then we said that we would have a turnout of over 57%. And actually, we smashed that. It was 63.4%, with the mail-in ballots playing a very large part in that, actually. Then our strongest prediction was the SNP between 61 and 64 seats. That was at 3.35. Of course, the SNP got exactly 64 seats, so nice bit of profit on that. The Welsh Parliament elections was our weakest. I think I certainly underestimated the Labour success, whereas my good friend Griff Parry from last week thought that Labour would do well, so well done to him. So Labour actually increased its seats from 29 to 30, which was still one short of a majority. So our first prediction, which was no Labour majority, was correct, but that was only 1.2, so very small odds. Where we did lose was, I thought that Labour would be losing a few seats. So I thought Plaid Cymru might win Llanelli, which was at 1.94, but actually they increased their majority there. But also as a bit of a sort of rogue shout, I didn't think it would happen, but I thought he was under pressure. Mark Drayford to lose his seat in Cardiff West to Plaid was at 3.95. But actually he increased his majority from 1,000 to around 11,000, which I found very surprising. But two reasons for this. Possibly one is we saw this pattern in every home nation in the UK, was an incumbent vaccine bounce. So we hear often this talk of rally around the flag. And that was certainly the case in Wales, where there was probably the greatest success of the vaccine programme. So so that could have played a role in Labour's success. But also someone mentioned this, and I agree with it, was so Welsh Labour managed to hold on to the Brexit voting constituencies. And a reason for this possibly is because whilst Remain Labour in England had a sort of feeling of distaste towards pride in English identity and culture. I'm saying not everyone, but there was certainly a feel of that. In Wales, Remain Labour certainly had a very strong campaign of pride for culture, Welsh culture and identity. And I think that played a very strong role in these, in not sort of breaking the ties with the traditional working class vote, because attachment to place, as we've seen, plays a very important role in politics. And I think this was a big reason why Andy Burnham was also very much comfortably re-elected as Manchester Mayor, because he's always had a very strong sense of Mancunian identity and culture and attachment to that. So that's a reason, I think. Moving on to Hartlepool. Yeah, we did very well there. So we said the Tory win was the sort of bread and butter bet. So that was at 1.58. So that was, if you got on that early enough, that would have been good. What I was most impressed about was actually Conservatives between 50 and 55% of the vote at 3.45. We predicted that correctly. The Tories got 51.9%, which was a 23% increase. So absolutely smashed Labour out the park. And finally, we said Thelma Walker, who is a member of the Northern Independence Party, but had to stand as an independent because they couldn't fill out the paperwork. We predicted she'd get under 5% of the vote. And I think she didn't even get 1% of the vote. So that was at 1.74. Really inflated odds, just because if you remember, David Cameron once said, Britain isn't Twitter, and outside of Twitter, the Northern Independence Party has become a bit of a laughing stock, to be honest. So we've talked about the Red Wall a lot in the previous episode, so I'm not going to go into more detail. We will bring it back up again next episode, because there will be a by-election in Batley and Spen, which is one of those sort of Red Wall 2.0 seats. So our focus is really on Scotland today. So, but in terms of predictions, we did very well again with the Red Wall Council. So we said that Labour would hold on to Kingston upon Hull. They managed to do so with a reduced majority from 5 to 3, Lib Dems gaining. We said Labour would also hold on to Bury. They did again with very fine margins, majority up from 4 to 2, but they held on as we predicted. Then, as we predicted, the Tories took hold of both Cannock Chase and Amber Valley, and actually they absolutely romped home in Amber Valley. So the Labour advantage of 25 to 19 seats was completely reversed to a Tory advantage of 28 to 18 seats. So quite a turnaround. And yeah, Labour's in big trouble, actually, because not only are they losing the Hartlepool end of the Hampstead-Hartlepool Alliance, they're actually losing the progressive votes to the Greens in both Sheffield and Bristol. So they're getting attacked on two fronts now. So Labour, they're on the brink of collapse, but we'll see if it goes any further. We also said that Durham would lose its majority. Well, Labour would lose its majority in Durham. All 129 seats were up. Labour's 7-seat majority was lost. Still the biggest party, as we said. It lost 16 seats. Tories gained 14. Lib Dems 2. One thing we didn't get correct was Rotherham. I thought Labour would lose its majority there just because of the sort of Casey report still ingrained in the locals' minds. It held on by the skin of its teeth. Labour seats dropped from 48 to 32. Tories unbelievably up from 0 to 20. Labour just about hangs on, but we'll see just how long they can hold on to Rotherham for. Finally, the London mayoral elections. So at the start, Sadiq Khan had a bit of a scare with the voting counting coming in, but he managed to get in quite comfortably in the end. So we said Sadiq Khan wouldn't win on first preference. That was 1.23, not great odds, but still something. And then we said the Conservatives would win Havering and Redbridge. That was at 2.24, which I thought was rather generous, but we'll take that. Very nice. And finally, the sort of my lump of the week came in with the Tory national equivalent vote share. They smashed that, 1.57. Very nice. So in total, £185.20 profit. I'll take that. Good first week, very solid basis to build off. So now I want to bring in my guest for this week, Cameron Stewart, who is a former member of the Scottish Conservatives. So good afternoon, Cameron.
Thanks for having me on, Julian. Hello there.
Thanks. And so what role exactly did you play in the Scottish Conservatives and Scottish politics in general?
Okay, so my first role was I was the lead staff member of a group called Wealthy Nation, which was the centre-right campaign group for independence, which went about as well as you can imagine. And afterwards, when I rejoined the Conservative Party after the referendum, I worked with Ruth Davidson in our constituency office in Glasgow, and then moved from there to work for the Strategy and Coordination Committee for the party, focusing on electoral strategy. I served in that role till the end of 2017, after which I then stayed for a couple of years, joined the SDP, and effectively became the National Secretary of the party in Scotland, then its leader, and then stood for the leadership of the Federal Party in 2020, which would not go well, let's say it that. And since then, I've just been outside of politics and observing as a guy watching the horse race rather than a participant, which is a nice, refreshing change.
Well, I'm sure you'll be diving back into some sort of role soon. I know you too well. So we're just going to remind everyone of the official results, and then we'll dive into some analysis. So this was probably the most stable election in Holyrood history. There was the least amount of changes in seating. So only 3 constituency seats actually changed hand. All 3 were SNP gains. So in Edinburgh Central, which was Ruth Davidson's former seat, Angus Robertson managed to take that off the Tories. And in Ayr as well, the Conservatives lost its longest standing MSP. So that's another big loss for the party. And then in East Lothian, the SNP gained from Labour. But so you're probably thinking, oh, is that not an SNP majority? No, because of the Scottish voting system, because the SNP took 2 constituency seats in the south of Scotland, it automatically lost 2 list seats in the south of Scotland. So it sort of balanced it out. So the final results, we have the SNP on 64 seats, gaining 1, but 1 short of a majority, crucially. Tories remained on 31, so another decent result for them. Labour down to 22, so lost 2. And the Greens up to 8. But there was some controversy about sort of another Green party making them lose seats. What was that about?
So what happened is that there is a party called Independent Green Voice, which stood on the ballot, I believe, in all of the regions, and got around average that I think is about 14,000 votes across Scotland. The Greens are quite angry about this because they believe this was effectively a confusion tactic done by an individual who has some unionist leanings but hadn't really done anything in politics in a very long time. The Independent Green Voice, while having been registered for many years, hasn't really been active for quite a long time. This is their first election I think they participated in since 2013. So it's they're quite annoyed about this. They think that they've lost at least 2 seats because of this. So they're well put a complaint to the Election Commission. Once you add in Alapa, which I know you will probably get to at some point, they think that number could have went up to possibly 4 seats they've lost out on because of electoral chicanery. Let's just put it that way.
And do you think they could be successful in that bid, or?
It's irrelevant to the election because they can't reverse the seats. So that's not going to happen.
Oh, okay.
The Electoral Commission might end up deregistering Independent Green Voice, which it does have the power to do. I wouldn't be surprised if they did that, but it may create some worrying precedents if they did, for example, for groups like, say, the Socialist Labour Party, if they were to say certain words are owned by certain organisations. So while I'm sympathetic to the Greens in this front, it's one of those tough luck situations.
And just to round off the result, the Lib Dems, who it's one of those parties like the poor old Lib Dems, but yeah, they lost another seat, so they're down to 4. The sort of the apogee of the Scottish Lib Dems seems to,
which is really critical, because under the Scottish Parliament standing orders, to be recognised as a formal party, you need 5 seats. So so the Liberal Democrats now, unless either standing orders change, or as I have suggested, the Conservative Party essentially loan them an MSP to essentially get them up to 5, aren't entitled to they aren't entitled to their leader to ask Nicola Sturgeon a question at First Minister's questions. They aren't entitled to committee places automatically. They're not entitled to be on the business committee, which determines the sort of the parliamentary body. And yeah, it's a really significant blow, because that also means they're not entitled to funding.
Oh, wow.
They're funded as independents now, not as a party. So what might happen is, because for funding purposes, the critical numbers are 5 to be a party, 15 to get the uptick as an opposition, and 30 to get what's called the additional upgrade. Because the Conservatives are above 30, and they got the 31, they got that critical one, it might make sense for them as an act of generosity to just say, we will loan you someone to put you in your group, but they're still going to vote with us just to get you over the line. And that might possibly happen. I suspect what's more likely is the standing orders will be changed to get into 4, because realistically, that probably is the best option for everyone. But it wouldn't surprise me if electorally they do something like that, but we may get onto the reasons later on.
Oh, okay, well, yeah, I never realised that, actually. I felt sorry for them, but now I feel even more for them. Yeah. But having looked at those results, did that surprise you at all, the results, or did you expect something like that?
Not really. This election was quite low key in the way it was done, and to be entirely honest, this was very much a much to do about nothing election. Realistically, the mass required for the SNP to get a majority was very particular, and they had to win very particular constituencies around the country to do it. The way that their growth was, the seats that they won, realistically, they should have won. So Edinburgh Central was won in 2016, effectively off the back of a leadership bounce that leader of political parties get. Ruth Davidson got a leadership bounce, and the Greens took enough of a split probably to give her the seat compared to the SNP. Ayr had realistically should have been an SNP seat since about 2011. And the fact that John Scott held on to it for as long as he did is very much a sign of how well liked he was in the area. East Lothian, having always been Labour since 1999. Again, it's a seat that should have realistically been SNP for a while based on its demographics. For them to get a majority, they should have won Aberdeenshire West. If they didn't win that, they weren't getting a majority. And Alistair Burnett and the Conservatives just held on to that with what is quite clearly has been a unionist tactical vote. So there has been quite clearly on the ground, there was evidence of unionists voting for the best unionist candidate. That wasn't entirely equal in the way it was done. So Conservative voters were very willing to vote for Labour and Liberal candidates in order to beat the SNP. They were very willing to do that. They put the union above everything else. For Liberal candidates, they were willing to do it. For Liberal voters, they were willing to do it for both the Labour and the Conservatives. For the Labour Party, they couldn't do it for the Tories, and that it has arguably cost the Conservative seats. In places like both Perthshire seats, North and South, that probably has cost them through there. In places like Aberdeenshire East, there is a clear divide that exists. If you are a Labour voter in Scotland, you still can't put a cross next to the Conservative Party. And unless the Conservatives try and change the brand or try and make themselves softer and more open to the values of Labour voters in Scotland, they will never be able to address that problem. And it might explain why the Conservatives took the strategy they did in this election. But other than that, everything went roughly as you would expect.
Do you think that's why recently, for example, Douglas Ross said that if Boris Johnson had broken ministerial code, he should be sacked? Do you think that's a sort of way of presenting an olive branch to Labour voters to try and say, well, maybe to say that the Scottish Tories aren't the same as the English Tories? Yeah.
It definitely, I would say it was an attempt. It's also one that, to be fair to Douglas Ross, has been a consistent line within him pretty much his entire career. He has a tendency to resign from stuff. Ever since he got elected as a councillor in Murray in 2007, I believe, he has resigned quite a few times from council committees and from even from the UK cabinet. He's resigned from. So he is committed to his principles, and he will probably mean what he said with that. But the Scottish Conservatives have made a lot of effort since Ruth Davidson came leader in 2011 to appear to be a softer, more centrist party for Scottish Unionist voters, and they have made a lot of effort to distance themselves from the National Party, hence why Boris Johnson didn't appear once in the entire campaign in Scotland. It has made inroads. It has clearly, the fact that the Conservatives were able to hold on to getting their entire core vote out to get the 31 seats is a sign that they did succeed in their objective in this election. But and you're now starting to see the moves towards trying to open himself up now. Douglas Ross saying in the papers today that he wanted to create a more open Conservative Party beyond the constitutional question. And that will be necessary if he wants to form a government. The question becomes, can he convince voters that he is able to do that?
And what's quite astonishing, really, is that we got this rather stable result. But if you look at polls around November, so I mentioned these polls last week, but around September, October, November 2020, the SNP were polled at around 58, sometimes 59%. And then support for independence on some polls were about 10, 13 points ahead. And now suddenly the SNP seem to have lost around 10, 11% of their vote in the space of 6 months. And support for the union is now ahead by around, depends what poll you look at, but between 5 and 8%. And that's with don't know is included, I believe. How has everything changed in this space of 6 months?
You said it yourself in your introduction. A large part of that will be down to the vaccine bounce. The UK government had made a really big effort to try and make this as a UK-wide effort rather than just a Scottish effort. Nicola Sturgeon arguably benefited last year from very much being the face of the pandemic, not just in Scotland, arguably in a lot of the UK as well. And she benefited from appearing quite distinct and different from the messaging that was occurring down south. So there was a competency value she was benefiting from. That was always going to decline after situations like, for example, the exam fiasco last year, and after certain issues that have occurred in the last few months, and the questions that have risen in the likes of Alapa, and even though they didn't get any seats, and general competency questions that are raised from it, that was always going to happen. If I was, however, the UK government, the one thing I would be concerned about is that even though the numbers for support for the union in the independence question have kind of settled back to where they were in around 2017, 2018, I would put a caveat on that those numbers are still pretty unstable. Like, they are fluctuating quite quickly. There are far less people there are far more people in the don't know category who voted no in 2014 than voted yes. And there are certain, if you delve into crosstabs in polling, there are more people who voted no in 2014 that are undecided on the constitutional question now. And if I am the UK government, and if there was to be a referendum in this parliament, I would be looking at that as a potential cause for concern.
And you mentioned Alaba and Alex Salmond. Did the Alex Salmond affair play a role in the SNP's fall, or is that another one of those sort of like, well, it's not the Westminster bubble, the Hollywood bubble. Did it really affect the average Scottish voter, this case?
It had an impact. So in my day job, I run a convenience store on the south side of Glasgow in Nicola Sturgeon's constituency, and it did come up. Customers were bringing this up unprompted. It did clearly cut through to an extent, mostly because it reminded people how much they disliked Alex Salmond, which is always a useful thing to do if you are someone who doesn't like his politics or doesn't like nationalism. The thing I would say about Alapa, in kind of a blessing in disguise for the SNP, is that removing the sort of harder line on the constitutional questions people out of the SNP into this separate entity, and having it get, and let's put this politely, utterly trounced electorally, is a good way for her to calm down those that remained within the SNP. So she now has far more control over the timetable than she would have had probably without Alex Salmond being there. Because without Alex Salmond having done this, there's a good possibility that there would be a segment of her party base who would see this result and go, there's a national majority, push a referendum now. And she can now look at those people and say, look at Alpa, they wanted that, look where they got them. There's not support for it, shut up. And probably in nicer language than that, but very much say, sit down, I'm the one driving. And so that is very much a blessing in disguise, I think, for the SNP that this has happened. What Alpa do afterwards is genuinely up in the air right now. There is talk from them that they want to carry on. They want to insist that they are in this for the long haul, and I am necessarily going to doubt them on that. I just wonder what viability a party like Alpa has right now, given the electoral landscape in Scotland.
It's interesting I was going to raise this point because actually yesterday I read that had Alex Salmond been elected, there were SNP ministers who were ready to defect to Alba. Do you think that any of that is true, or?
It wouldn't surprise me just because of how close-knit a lot of the inner workings of the SNP are. One of the major criticisms of the way Scottish politics has worked in Hollywood, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, has been just how closely intertwined the SNP top brass are with the mechanery of government. And very much the sort of the fact that, for example, the chief executive of the SNP is also the husband of the first minister is, for an example. There are some potential conflict of interest that could occur there. So it wouldn't surprise me, considering just how interconnected Alex Salmond was with a lot of these people, if that was the case. I think it's an interesting counterfactual if he was elected as to whether or not Alpa might have essentially tried to be a centre-right nationalist party, because there have been inklings for years that there were figures within the SNP that did want to move to create two different nationalist parties, one of the left and one of the right. So that might have possibly been a viable option if he'd been elected, but at this point, we're probably never going to know. I think I know who would have done it, but at this point, it's probably best to leave and let sleeping dogs lie.
So if we look at the result, so the SNP are claiming a mandate because their total and the Greens total, who we know are pro-independent, have a majority. But the Unionists are saying because, first of all, the SNP missed out on the majority by 1, but also if you look at the popular vote, I think the pro-union parties won by about 40,000, so not a lot in it, but still there seems to be more support for unionist parties than separatist parties. So who's right? Who has a mandate? Who doesn't have a mandate?
They're going to argue about this, and that's really the entire crux of Scottish politics pretty much for the last 20 years, is that you have these parties arguing about their own mandates. The SNP and the Greens will probably move towards a Section 30 order at some point in this Parliament. I don't know exact timeframes from that. If I was to make a guess, I would say sometime in 2022. I think that would be the sort of first occasion I think it would make sense for them to do it. The unionist parties will obviously oppose that for obvious reasons. And then it will be down to whatever the UK government does. The Scottish government seem really up for the idea of having a fight with the UK government in the courts on this, which makes me think that they have read or seen they have some advice that the rest of us haven't. If I was advising the UK government, because Section 30 of the Scotland Act doesn't actually say they have to respond, I would just leave it. If I was them, I would essentially leave it on red and say, we'll get back to you. And just ignore them. And just say, leave it at that, we'll get back to you, and just never respond. And kind of just let them do it. Or just kind of let them see what happens. Because Nicola Sturgeon said during the campaign that she would not call a wildcat referendum. She made that very clear repeatedly, she would not call one. And if your strategy is either a unionist one or is to just try and show up the SNP, it might be viable for you to just say, we're going to just, do it. And just we're not giving you support, we're not giving you anything, we're just not saying yes or no. And because you don't give them the court battle that way as well. For the SNP and the Greens, it's probably frustrating for them. It's exactly the same boat we're in right now. And if they didn't get a mandate in the last 5 years to do it, you can argue they haven't got it now. But they would obviously say that having got the support and having said quite clearly in their manifestos this time, unlike in 2016, where the SNP and the Greens had different commitments on the question, they had exactly the same wording. They'd clearly spoken to each other about what they wanted on it. It is exact word for word exactly the same. So I think that question is a bit different this time. So they'll argue about it. They both probably think they have fair mandates on it. A Section 30 order will probably be sent at some point in the Parliament, and whatever happens then, God knows.
Yeah, well, from an English point of view, it's frustrating, but from a Scottish point of view, it must be even more frustrating. But it feels as if Scotland is stuck in this constant loop of the constitution and independence just being brought up again and again. Do you think we'll ever when can Scotland see the back of this? Like, when can we go back to just talking about, healthcare, education, without having to have the constitution question?
The irony of this election, in some ways, is that this was probably the most normal Scottish election that I can remember in quite a long time, because bar the Conservatives, who wanted to get their core vote out on the constitutional question, pretty much everyone else was trying to avoid it. Everyone else was trying to not talk about it. It was just Labour wanted to focus on their revival. Anna Zarwa, by all accounts, had a very good campaign despite the loss in seats, which were mostly just down to the Conservatives gaining on the list vote. They are planning something a bit more long-term by the looks of it, and it would be interesting to see where they go with it. The Greens wanted to focus on the climate emergency, and while they were talking about the constitution very occasionally, it was very much when they were brought into it rather than then bringing it up proactively. The Lib Dems focused on Willie Rennie and his usual photo stunt operation, which always is a great laugh in elections. It's one of the things we most look forward to seeing, what stunt Willie Rennie is going to get somebody to pay for. And my favourite one this year was the deck chair. That was fantastic. Like Willie Rennie is one of the things that makes Scottish politics fun is seeing what the man's going to do next. And the SNP want to focus on the recovery because they wanted to run like a government. And that was a really nice change, actually, to see them run on the record. And it to be held to account for in parts of it. There was one moment in a debate where I talking about drug deaths in Scotland, and having the First Minister say quite evidently, in my opinion, that she put her eye off the ball is a rare lapse. But it's a sign that things can move back to normal. The bigger issue, I think, is that there are enough people in Scotland who want to change the constitutional arrangements that any multi-party election, they will not get a majority, but they'll get so close to it that it basically doesn't matter and it's effectively a majority. But there's probably not enough of them to actually change the constitutional arrangements. So you're in this same to what Quebec was in the mid-80s and the early 90s, is that there was probably enough to just keep electing the Parti Québécois in the National Assembly in Quebec, but not enough to formally force secession efforts. And I fear Scotland might be in a similar situation. A second referendum might be the solution to it. A Clarity Act might be the solution to it. It really depends on fundamentally what the voters of Scotland want. And at this point, honestly, God knows.
Well, we actually spoke about a Clarity Act in my first episode with my friend who is pro-Welsh independent. So I'm just wondering, what do you think? What would a Clarity Act look like in Scotland, and would it gain support?
A Clarity Act is an idea which kind of bubbles under the cauldron in the constitutional debate that we've had in the last few years, particularly in Liberal Democrat and Labour circles. So the Lib Dems and the Labour Party are kind of in this no man's land where they can't truly out-unionist the Conservative Unionist Party. So because of this, they're kind of in this no man's land where they have to say the sort of things the Tories do, but they can't really seem like they're committed to it in the same way. So the idea of a Clarity Act has been quite popular in those circles. The challenge it would have in Scotland is that we've already had a referendum set on a very particular set of rules. And any effort to move away from those rules would be seen by nationalists as trying to rig the referendum. So if you move towards, say, what Montenegro had in 2004 in their referendum, where you had a 55% rule, they would kick off as, and I would argue rightfully actually, as trying to change the rules of the referendum after the fact. If you wanted to have a confirmatory vote afterwards, after a period of negotiation, they would argue that was trying to effectively force the UK government to make the terms as bad as possible for their own benefit. And because this has already happened, you do have to take that into account in decision-making regarding a Clarity Act. I think there is value to it. I think there would be an appeal to voters to essentially take both governments out of the equation, and particularly given Scotland's constitutional tradition, giving the power of the question into the hands of Scottish people would sound quite well. It's how the SNP phrase the argument for a referendum. It could be successful. It could be something that could gain traction, particularly within the Labour Party, possibly the Liberal Democrats. It really just depends on writing it in a way that doesn't effectively make nationalists believe that you're trying to rig it against them, which would be, it would be easier to, you have more options if 2014 hadn't happened, or if you'd done it just after 2014. Now you're kind of locked into the same sort of rules realistically in a legal referendum.
Okay, yeah, because for example, the likes of George Galloway and All for Unity, and I think Michael Gove said he was interested by the idea was to increase the electorate to allow Scottish people living in other UK nations to have a vote as well. Would that ever be possible, or is that something the SNP would always block?
That is something that I suspect not the SNP would block, but I think there would be legal challenges to that. I suspect if you were going to make it that Scottish voters living in the UK would have a vote, first of all, you'd have to define how that was being done. Would it be a single constituency? Would it be in the constituency they used to come from, etc.? But you would probably have legal challenges from Scots living internationally as well to be able to vote in the same way. As a result, I don't particularly think that's viable. I think it's also worthwhile to point out, for because you brought him up, George Galloway having pretty much no success with his All for Unity project, primarily because voters were reminded of the two things they dislike more than anything else: George Galloway. A polarizing figure, if nothing else, but also just from a mathematical standpoint, the way that he designed the party and the way it campaigned was genuinely ludicrous in terms of just basic arithmetic. Labour are unhappy. They think that Alliance for Unity, or All for Unity, cost them at least one seat. They think that has probably done that. Like, it's probably helped the Greens also a couple of seats as well, as they're warned. It's the idea of having a single unionist candidate isn't terrible if you want to have formal tactical voting. The problem is that voters won't necessarily do what you want them to do, particularly if the candidate is a Conservative candidate and a Conservative candidate, you're a Labour voter, you might not choose to do that. And secondly, that it's fundamentally, voters don't like not being given choice. They don't. There's a particular thing in how our electoral system works, in the way that we do democracy, that we kind of don't like these kind of deals. We don't like parties not standing to help somebody else. It's the thought experiment would be the Liberal Democrats in this election lost, I believe, over 70% of their deposits for the constituency seats. It would have been about 70%. So I think they retained about 12 or something in the ballpark of that. And logically speaking, you would not stand in constituencies you have absolutely no chance in winning. If, for example, most of the south of Scotland, a lot of the Central Belt, if you were them, you wouldn't stand, because why waste your money? Why waste your £500 and your candidate's time and effort when you can focus better on the list and in places you have a better chance of winning? The problem is, the second the Lib Dems don't stand in every single constituency, people start jumping up and down about how they're helping the Tories win stuff. And it's helping the Tories win stuff, and also how they're not a serious national party anymore. So you force these, particularly the free unionist parties, to have to contest every seat against each other. And until you change the structure of that, until you change possibly even the electoral system, there's been discussion of that more in the last few days, especially with the consequences of ALPA, while not being successful, really opening up some of the downfalls of the additional member system. There have been some discussion about possibly opening up the electoral system, changing it to STD, or some other legal change to make it slightly harder to do what has been done potentially in this election and many others to come. So that is a potential way this could go. It's also potentially interesting there may be boundary changes that could also come up. I believe this is the last election that should be fought on these boundaries, at least as far as I'm aware.
I believe Scotland are losing 2 seats in the boundary changes.
No, for the Scottish Parliament.
The
Scottish Parliament is legally meant to do boundary changes every 10 years. So after 2021, they should be doing boundary changes for this election. That will be interesting to see what they do. It seems like a decent opportunity to change the electoral system or expand the membership, which have been two, particularly for the SNP, things that they've wanted to do for quite a long time. So it seems like this would be a viable option towards doing that.
Okay, so this is more of a long-term tip. So I was looking at the odds for when the next Scottish independence referendum could be. So you have this year 20 to 1, 2022 or 23 6 to 1, 2024 10 to 1, and 2025 or later at evens. What right now? When do you think we will have this? Or if we do have one, when will it be, do you think?
Okay. My gut feeling is that it would depend on what sort of referendum you're talking about. I would not be surprised if at some point in this parliament there was I'm not going to say a wildcat referendum, because it potentially, if the UK government just choose to not give an answer on the Section 30 request, there may just be a plebiscite question on independence that wouldn't be legally binding, which I believe is probably within the Parliament's jurisdiction to do, of a non-binding plebiscite. If they do that, I suspect unionists would boycott, and that would probably be sometime in 2023, 2024, I would make a guess. If you're talking about a legal referendum, that will probably not happen in this Parliament unless potentially Labour have to rely on SNP support in 2024 to make a Labour government in Westminster. That might change the dynamic, but otherwise I would be surprised if there was a legal referendum in this Parliament. Potentially the next election might be interesting, because that's when you're starting to get to the generation limits. A political generation would normally be defined as when the youngest voters in the election have no conscious memory of that action. And if you're talking about those who were around 3, because we have voted 16 in Scotland when the referendum was being held, you can start to argue that they don't have a conscious memory of the referendum. So you can start to argue at that point you're looking towards a referendum being met, especially with the generation condition. So I would advise people start watching the language that the SNP use to talk about a referendum, because that may start coming up when they talk about it's been a generation since, and to watch that sort of tick happen around the end of this Parliament.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. So we're just gonna, because on Thursday we actually have a by-election. So the poor old Scots have to go out and vote once again, which I'm sure they're pleased about. So this one is in Airdrie and Shotts, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes.
So the seat was vacated by Neil Gray because he wanted to stand in the sort of equivalent in the Scottish Parliament. Yes,
the SNP changed their rules after the during the Edinburgh Central selection process. They never officially said it for this reason, but Joanna Cherry and Angus Robertson were going for Edinburgh Central for the Scottish Parliament. And one of the things that they did during that process was say that if you were selected as an SNP candidate for Holyrood and you held a dual mandate, so if you were a councillor or if you were a technically councillor, but I don't think any of the councillors have resigned yet. I think they may have resigned after election. And an MP particularly, you couldn't hold both mandates at the same time. So when the nominations were sent in for the papers about 6 weeks ago, Neil Gray resigned.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if we're looking at this, so Labour actually held the seat until 2015. In the last UK election, so remember that this is not a Scottish parliamentary election, this is a by-election for the UK. Parliament. So in 2019, the SNP got 17.9k, Labour 12.7k, Tory 7k, Lib Dems 1.4k. So if you add all the unionist vote together, it is higher than the SNP vote. Do you think we'll see any tactical voting to try and get the SNP out?
You're likely to see some tactical voting in this election, primarily from Conservative voters. The 2017 in particular, in a lot of the Central Belt, was a high watermark for the Conservative Party for quite a long time, in terms of their supports, in electoral support at least. 2019 seen a slight drop off, but it was in particular seats potentially enough to flip the difference. So you may see Conservative tactical voting. The other issue that exists in this by-election is that there is a British Unionist Party candidate, which is to put it in the simplest way I can, a party that has traditionally had ties with the Orange Order, which is a loyalist organisation which has a decent following in particularly Airdrie and to a lesser extent Shotts. So as a result, that might possibly make us a bit less likely to be fully successful, but I suspect some voters will vote Labour to try and get the SNP out.
And if they truly want to sort of tactically vote, what's the point in this unionist party, smaller unionist party standing? Surely they know that they're just splitting the vote. So
primarily because the problem when it comes to tactical voting, especially when we talk about a unionist nationalist concept, is that while voters do have a view on the constitutional question, they don't necessarily align that view as being more important than their ideological one. So if you are a left-wing unionist, you are probably not going to be that comfortable voting for someone who is on the right, who is also a unionist. Same could exist for the left, and for the right and the left, etc. So while I understand why people, especially south of the border, really want there to be sort of tactical voting against the SNP, it does fundamentally ignore the fact that particularly the three major unionist parties have a century of history each between them. And you can't just pretend that that doesn't exist for the sake of trying to get that through. There's too much pride there. There's too much pride in them as national parties that they will never truly stand down for one another.
Okay. So I'm looking at the odds aren't great for sort of, I don't know if you've had a look, but for winning party, the SNP is just miles ahead, so terrible odds. The only one that sort of caught my interest was a turnout under 50% being at 3.1, because the turnout was 59% for the Scottish parliamentary vote last Thursday. And I just feel as if there'll be that voter fatigue and there just won't be as much importance placed on this. What are your feelings?
The by-elections always have lower turnouts anyway, and I think possibly being a week after a Scottish election might possibly be affecting turnout. So I wouldn't be surprised if it was below half. The only caveat I'd state is that postal votes would have went out for this seat as well for those who were registered for the Scottish Parliament, and postal votes are only returned around 2/3. So if I'm trying to remember the rough layout, but I think around 30% of voters in Airdrie Shotts in the equivalent Scottish Parliament seats had postal votes sent out to them. So if similar numbers were occurred for the Westminster seat, you might possibly be pushing 49-50 potentially, but that depends on them turning out in that way as well. So it's a good bet to bet under, but that would be my one potential warning as a caveat.
Yeah, so I'm going to tip that. I think 3.1, pretty good odds. Did you find anything interesting yourself, or?
Not particularly in terms of there. I think when you look at elections like this, you should look at all the candidates, and there's an interesting fight at the bottom between between Reform UK, UKIP, and the SDP, and I think they're sort of fighting for what I would say is best of the rest status. I should potentially be an interesting battle. UKIP have a small core vote in that part of the world, have traditionally stood there, but really didn't have that good an election for the Scottish Parliament. I think only got about 400 votes across all of central Scotland on the list. Reform UK did slightly better. I think around 600, I believe, but for all counts of voters, it's a new party. Even though we know it is the Brexit Party, having been formed in 2019 by Nigel Farage to try and ensure Brexit happens, we know that voters will not necessarily be aware of that, and they just see this new logo that they haven't recognised. And for the SDP, Neil Manson is a guy I know quite well. He's a good guy by all accounts, but I think he might struggle here solely because, unlike the other parties in that fight, he hasn't had the opportunity to campaign in the Scottish election beforehand. The SDP stood no candidates in central Scotland, and I do believe that might put him at a disadvantage in that sort of best of the rest battle. So if you want to put a bet on that, that might be worth some value, but that's pretty much the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, I think, yeah, certainly something to consider. And I think problem is, yeah, the SNP are very likely to reclaim this seat, so the odds aren't great. But yeah, I think turnout certainly for me will be the most interesting to look at. Okay, well, we've come to the end. It's been really great speaking to you, Cameron. Thanks very much for coming on.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me on, Julian.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.